I always imagined walking my daughter down the aisle would be one of the proudest moments of my life. And in some ways, it was. But the part one never anticipated, the part no father ever prepares for, is when that walk becomes the last moment you recognize the person beside you. Her hand was light on my arm, her smile radiant. But somewhere beneath all that satin and lace was a woman I didn't quite know anymore. I told myself it was the nerves, the ceremony, the whirlwind of the day. But even as the music swelled and the guests stood, something in me knew. This wasn't going to end how I thought. I kept my back straight and my steps steady, giving her away not just to a man, but maybe to a version of herself I no longer had a place in. The reception was beautiful. People laughed, clinked champagne glasses, and danced under strings of soft golden lights. I watched from my table, swirling ice in a glass of ginger ale, because I'd already promised myself I wouldn't drink tonight. I wanted to remember every part of this. I wanted to hold on to something, anything, that felt like love. My wife, Marion, flitted from guest to guest like a hostess at a gala, glowing in her mother-of-the-bride moment. I caught her eye a few times, hoping for a look, a smile, some sign that we were still in this together. But she was gone before I could finish blinking. So I sat. I smiled. I waited for the part of the evening where I'd give my toast, say my piece, and maybe remind my daughter, my only child, that her father had always been her shield. But that moment never came. Instead, it came from her. It was during the speeches. People were laughing and buzzing from too much wine and too many past hors d'oeuvres. The best man went first, stumbling through some poorly veiled jokes about their college days. Then her maid of honor followed, crying through every other sentence, making the whole room teary-eyed. And then, it was her turn. My daughter took the mic, looking elegant and poised in a way that would have made her 10-year-old self blush with pride. She cleared her throat, looked out across the crowd, and said with a smirk, "Today marks the beginning of my real independence. No more overprotective dad issues." The room erupted in laughter. I didn't. She wasn't done. No more curfews, no more background checks on my friends, no more awkwardly threatening my boyfriends in the driveway. I am a married woman now, y'all. I finally made it out of lockdown. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me like a slow tide. People turned to see how I'd react. I gave them what they were looking for, a polite smile, a soft chuckle, and a nod as if to say, "You got me." But inside, I felt gutted, like someone had taken a knife and carved out all those years of sacrifice and worry and turned them into a cheap punchline. Even Marion laughed, threw her head back, and clapped like it was the best stand-up routine she'd ever heard. That part stuck with me more than anything. Because when your child hurts you, there's always some part of your heart that makes excuses for them. She's young. She didn't mean it that way. She's just trying to be funny. But when your partner, your supposed ally, joins the applause, you realize you're standing alone. I watched the rest of the evening like a stranger at someone else's party. People came up to me with their drinks and their teethy grins, making offhand comments like, "Guess you're finally off duty, huh, Dad?" Or, "Bet it feels good to hand over the reins." I laughed along, but each time felt like sandpaper to the chest. They didn't know about the nights I sat by the door until 2 in the morning, waiting for her to come home safely. They didn't see the time I drove 3 hours to bail her out of a terrible situation with a toxic ex. They didn't see the hours I spent working overtime just to pay off her college tuition when scholarships fell short. No one saw those things because I never asked for applause. I did it because I loved her, because it was my job to protect her, because she was mine. But now, apparently, she was no longer mine to protect. She was free. The night ended with a sparkler send-off. Everyone lined up outside, waving burning sticks in the air while she and her new husband ran through the tunnel of flames like a scene from a rom-com. Marion kissed her on the cheek and cried. I hung back. I didn't want to ruin the photos with my face. Eventually, they drove off into the night in a vintage car I helped pay for, and everyone cheered like they were watching royalty. I picked up a stray sparkler from the grass, still warm in my hand, and tossed it into the trash. On the way home, Marion was still gushing. "Didn't she look beautiful?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "That dress. My God. And her speech. So funny. I wasn't expecting that. Were you?" I didn't answer. I just kept my eyes on the road. After a moment, she glanced at me. Oh, come on. Don't sulk. You are overprotective. She was just having fun. I let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then I said, yeah, she had fun. She sighed. You're being dramatic. I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. That night, I went to bed alone on the couch, not because we fought, but because I didn't want to sleep next to someone who thought my pain was a joke. I stared at the ceiling, playing her words over and over in my mind. No more overprotective dad issues. I guess she finally got what she wanted, and I finally learned what it felt like to be replaced. The house felt emptier after the wedding, but not in the sentimental way people talk about when their children move out or start a new life. It wasn't nostalgia or grief or even longing. I'd felt all those before when she left for college or when she took her first job out of state. This was different. This was silence that accused, quiet that hovered in corners and settled in my chest like dust on forgotten shelves. I moved through the rooms like a guest in my own home, brushing past picture frames and souvenirs from family vacations that no longer felt like shared memories. Each one reminded me of a time when my presence was wanted, when my advice was needed. Now, even the photos seemed to mock me, captured smiles from a life I was no longer invited to participate in. For the first week, I tried to act normal. I made coffee in the morning like I always did, set out 2 mugs even though Marion had switched to smoothies years ago. I folded laundry, mowed the lawn, watered the plants. I even texted my daughter once, just a casual, hope the honeymoon was nice type of thing. She replied, it was perfect. Finally free. 2 words. Finally free. Like she'd been counting the days. I didn't respond. I stared at the message for a long while, letting it sink in that the thing I'd been most proud of, being a father, had somehow become a burden in her eyes. An obstacle she'd finally cleared. A phase she'd outgrown. Marion noticed the shift in me, but she didn't ask. She assumed I was sulking, as she so delicately put it. You need to lighten up, she said one evening as she poured herself a glass of wine. You're acting like she left you at the altar. I looked up from the newspaper I wasn't really reading and said, she embarrassed me. In front of everyone. She took a sip and shrugged. She was joking. You're being too sensitive. There it was again, that word. Sensitive. As if caring too much was a weakness. As if years of sacrifice and sleepless nights could be dismissed with a smirk and a glass of Merlot. I wanted to tell her everything I'd swallowed during that reception. How I felt invisible. How her laughter hurt more than our daughter's speech. How alone I'd felt watching the 2 people I loved most act like I was just the punchline to a tired story. But I didn't. Because somewhere along the way, I'd learned that speaking up didn't lead to understanding. It led to arguments, dismissals, and cold shoulders. So instead, I started retreating. I stopped making small talk at dinner. I declined invites to family events. I turned down her idea of starting a group chat with our new in-laws. I figured if they all wanted independence so badly, I'd give it to them. No more check-ins. No more unsolicited advice. No more being the emotional workhorse everyone leaned on when life got messy. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expect. I was just tired. Tired of being seen as overbearing when all I ever wanted was to protect what I loved. My detachment wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, methodical. I deleted the shared calendar we used for family plans. I removed my daughter from the GPS tracking app she once begged me to install for safety. I even boxed up some of her childhood mementos, dance recital programs, old birthday cards, the teddy bear she used to sleep with, and stored them in the attic. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer felt like the keeper of her past. She wanted a new life. I figured it was time I let her have it, without me standing in the doorway. I started spending more time in the garage, not fixing anything, just sitting there with the radio low and the door cracked open. Sometimes I'd watch the neighbor kids play across the street and wonder when everything shifted. When did being a good father turn into being a nuisance? I thought about calling my brother, maybe meeting up for a beer, but even that felt hollow. How do you explain that your daughter made you feel obsolete in front of 200 people and your wife laughed along like it was comedy hour? One night, I stayed out there until nearly midnight. Marion opened the door, arms crossed, irritation already written across her face. You just gonna live out here now? I shrugged. Might. She sighed. This can't be about the damn wedding still. I looked her dead in the eye and said, it's not about the wedding. It's about everything that came after. She didn't say anything to that, just turned and went back inside, leaving the door half open like she expected me to follow. I didn't. I sat there and listened to the low hum of the world going on without me. That's when it clicked. The problem wasn't just my daughter. It was the role I'd been forced into, silent provider, unthanked protector, emotional punching bag. And when I dared to be hurt, to set boundaries, I became the villain in their story. But maybe I was done playing roles. Maybe I was ready to just be a man who loved deeply, got burned for it, and chose to walk away before it killed something in him. The next morning, I brewed only 1 cup of coffee. It was just past midnight when the phone rang. I was already awake, staring at the ceiling in the guest bedroom, where I'd been sleeping on and off for the past few weeks. I didn't keep the ringer on loud anymore, hadn't needed to since the house quieted down after the wedding, but the vibration on the nightstand startled me anyway. I reached over slowly, more out of habit than concern. These days, no one really called me unless they needed something. And sure enough, her name lit up the screen. Danielle, my daughter, the woman who said she was finally free of my overprotective issues. I stared at the name longer than I should have, heart already thudding in that old, familiar rhythm of panic I'd known too well when she was a teenager sneaking out, or calling me stranded, or crying in the middle of some mess I always came running to clean up. When I finally answered, her voice hit me like a brick wall. Dad? She choked out, already in tears. Are you up? I didn't say anything right away. Just let the silence stretch between us. Her sobs filled the space, and even though part of me wanted to reach through the phone and gather her up in my arms like when she was 5 and scraped her knee, a much louder part of me remembered that speech. Her voice ringing out, bold and proud, announcing to the world that she no longer needed me, that I was a relic of her past, an inconvenience, a joke. Still, I asked, what's going on? He cheated, she whispered. Dad, he cheated on me. I came home early from dinner with my friends, and he was there, with someone, in our bed. I didn't gasp. I didn't clench my fist or curse or leap into action. I just sat there, listening, letting the words sink in like rain on concrete. They didn't surprise me. Something about her new husband always rubbed me the wrong way. Too slick, too charming, too quick to agree with whatever Danielle said without any real substance behind it. But I never said anything because every time I tried, I was accused of being controlling, too involved, stuck in the past. I didn't know who else to call, she went on, her voice cracking. I didn't want to call Mom yet. I don't know what to do. I packed a bag. I'm in the car. Can I come home? There it was. The thing I'd always been, home. The backup plan. The safety net. The invisible wall that kept her from falling all the way down. And for a moment, I felt myself wanting to break, to soften, to throw the door wide open and say, of course, sweetheart, I'll always be here. But then I thought of the way she stood up in front of our entire family, in front of friends, co-workers, neighbors, and dismissed me like some outdated software that was finally uninstalled. I thought of Marion laughing along. I thought of how everyone cheered her independence without ever asking what that word really meant. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and said, I think you should call your mother. Silence. Not even the sound of her crying. Just stunned, heavy silence. What? She stammered. I'm not the person you need right now, I said, keeping my voice level. Remember? You said you were finally free, that you didn't want my involvement. No more overprotective dad issues. Dad, come on, that was a joke. No, I interrupted, it wasn't. It was a choice. One you made. One everyone in that room heard. And I respected it. I backed off. I gave you the space you asked for. So now, when things fall apart, I'm not going to be the first one you run to. Her breathing became shaky again, but now the sobs had turned into something more jagged, part grief, part indignation. So what? You're just going to abandon me. I didn't abandon you, I said. You left me, and you made it very clear that you didn't want me in that part of your life. That comes with consequences. She went quiet again, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat. Wow. Okay, I'm not doing this to hurt you, I said, more gently now. But I can't keep stepping in only when it's convenient for you. That's not love. That's a crutch. But you're my dad, she whispered, voice breaking. You're supposed to care. I do care, I said. I always have. But I've learned that caring for someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself every time they snap their fingers. I'm tired, Danielle. I'm tired of being the only one who has to swallow hurt and pretend it's okay. She sniffled. So you're just done? No, I replied. I'm just not your doormat anymore. There was a long pause. Then a click. She hung up. I stared at the phone for a while after that, the screen dark and quiet. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt like someone who had finally drawn a line in the sand after years of being buried beneath it. I set the phone down and leaned back into the pillows, staring at the ceiling again. The silence didn't feel as heavy now. It felt earned. In the morning, Marion was already in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. I poured my coffee and sat across from her. She called me last night, she said without looking up. I figured. She was crying. Said you shut her out. I stirred my coffee and didn't respond. She needed us. No, I said. She needed a consequence. I'm not jumping every time she falls apart anymore. Especially not when I'm only ever invited in after the damage is done. Marion looked up at me then, eyes sharp. That's cruel, David. No, I said again, firmer this time. Cruel is raising a child to believe love only exists when it's convenient. Cruel is teaching her that she can humiliate her father 1 month and expect unconditional rescue the next. That's not how this works anymore. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw it. The realization dawning in her eyes that the man she'd married, the man who'd always quietly endured, was no longer playing that role. She's your daughter, she said, like it was some kind of spell. And I'll always love her, I replied. But love doesn't mean I set myself on fire every time she's cold. The first wave came on a Tuesday, 3 days after the phone call. It started with a text from my sister, Janine. We hadn't spoken in months, which was fine by me since most of our recent conversations had ended in her casually implying I was either too soft or too rigid depending on the day. The message was simple. Heard about Danielle. What the hell is wrong with you? No greeting. No question about how I was doing. Just that. A gut punch in 9 words. I stared at it for a while, heart rate steady, no rise of adrenaline like I might have expected. Because deep down, I had braced for this. I knew once word got out that I hadn't swooped in to rescue my daughter after her marriage cracked like a cheap wine glass. People were going to come for me. But it still stung, because the version of me they were all attacking didn't exist. They weren't responding to who I was. They were responding to the caricature she'd painted of me. By Wednesday, the calls started. Some from old family friends who'd attended the wedding and were now concerned. One of Marion's cousins, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, left a voicemail saying, I just can't believe you could be so cold. She's your baby girl. Doesn't matter what she said at the wedding. She was nervous. You're the adult. Act like it. I played the message twice, listening to the tone more than the words. It wasn't anger. It was judgment dipped in sugar. The kind of voice people use when they want to sound kind but believe they're better than you. I didn't return the call. I didn't know anyone that much access to my piece anymore. Then came the social media post. Not from Danielle. She was smarter than that. But from one of her friends. A vague, passive-aggressive story with a black background and white text that read, Some people will only love you when you're obedient. Boundaries are not betrayal. I rolled my eyes. The new gospel. I wasn't surprised it got traction. Hearts, comments, subtle affirmations from people who didn't even know me. I didn't have Instagram, but Marion did, and she made sure to leave her phone on the counter unlocked. Whether it was an accident or a test, I'll never know, but I saw the notifications when I passed by. So sorry she's going through this. No dad should ever turn his back. Healing is coming, girl. I could have screamed. I could have printed out the years of text messages, the receipts from late-night Uber rides, the emergency therapy bills I paid when Danielle had panic attacks in college, the voicemails where she sobbed because no one else picked up but me. I could have held up the pieces of myself I gave away one by one so she could grow up feeling safe, and I could have asked them all where they were when I was standing alone at her wedding reception, swallowing my dignity like it was communion. But instead, I just closed the app and pushed the phone aside. Let them talk. Let them gossip and speculate and cast stones. They weren't there for the silence afterward. They weren't there when I went home and quietly chose not to shatter. Marion wasn't subtle about her disapproval either. She started slamming cabinet doors a little harder, sighing louder during dinner, making comments with that poisoned sugar tone that only a spouse can perfect. "It must be nice to have such thick skin," she said one evening while slicing vegetables with unnecessary force. "Some of us are actually worried about our child." I looked up from the newspaper. She's not a child anymore. She's hurting. She's also capable. She wanted independence. She's got it. She dropped the knife into the sink with a clang and turned to face me, arms crossed. "You're punishing her for being proud." I stood up slowly, pushing in my chair. "No, I'm holding her accountable for being cruel." She didn't follow me when I walked out of the room. That night, she didn't sleep beside me. We'd become polite ghosts in the same house, passing each other like strangers in a museum of memories we no longer agreed on. And maybe that was inevitable. Maybe we were both clinging to different versions of the same daughter. Hers was still 10 years old and needed a hug. Mine had become someone who stood on a stage and told the world she was finally free of me. A few days later, my brother-in-law called. He tried to be diplomatic, the way people do when they're pretending to be peacemakers but are really just gathering information for the group chat. "Look, Dave," he said, "I get it. I do. But don't you think you've made your point?" "I wasn't making a point." "Come on. You didn't let her stay with you." Man, that's harsh." "She had options," I said. "She chose Mom. That's what she said she wanted. I'm respecting that." He went quiet, probably because he couldn't argue with that. He tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. I knew he'd hang up, call his wife, and I'd become the villain in the next chapter of the family gossip novel. And still, I didn't care. What no one seemed to understand was that my silence wasn't bitterness. It wasn't vengeance. It was a boundary long overdue. It was the quiet truth that sometimes love looks like letting someone sit in the consequences of their choices. Not because you don't care, but because you finally care about yourself too. I started waking up earlier, making my coffee slowly, reading in silence. I began fixing the fence out back I'd been ignoring for years. I went to the hardware store and chatted with the old guy at the register who remembered me from the time I helped him jump his car. I wasn't rebuilding anything monumental, just little pieces of myself. The parts that had eroded after years of being the guy who always answered the phone, always showed up, always said yes. One afternoon, while I was sanding down a crooked post, the neighbor's kid came over. He was maybe 7, missing a front tooth, holding a baseball in his hand. "Mr. D, want to play catch?" I looked at him and smiled. "Sure, kid." And for 15 minutes, I forgot about the judgment. I forgot about the texts, the social posts, the way Marion barely looked at me now. I just threw a ball back and forth with a kid who didn't think love was transactional or inconvenient. He just wanted someone to play catch. When he ran back home, I stood in the yard for a long time, looking up at the sky, and I realized I wasn't cold. I wasn't cruel. I was healing. I wasn't expecting company that Friday. I had just finished trimming the hedges. The sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, and I was looking forward to the quiet hum of an evening without conversation. I had gotten used to the rhythm of solitude, how it held you steady like the weight at the bottom of a fishing line. But as I was wiping sweat from my brow and coiling up the garden hose, I heard a familiar voice call out from the other side of the fence. "Still allergic to sitting still, huh?" It was Mark, my old friend from work. We hadn't seen each other in months, maybe a year. Life, as it often does, had a way of stretching time until friendships thinned into distant echoes. But there he was, wearing a ball cap and a grin like nothing had changed, holding 2 cold beers in his hands. I smiled despite myself. Mark was the kind of guy who showed up when you least expected it, but always when you needed someone to cut through the fog. I figured if I waited for an invite, I'd grow old waiting, he said, handing me a beer as he let himself into the backyard. I chuckled. "You're not wrong." We sat on the porch, cracking open our bottles, letting the silence settle the way it does with people who don't need to fill every second with noise. Eventually, he looked over at me, that same knowing look he used to give in the break room when I pretended I wasn't upset about something. "So," he said slowly, "I've been hearing things." "Of course you have," I replied, taking a sip. "Everyone has. That's the thing about family drama. It spreads faster than wildfire and burns just as hot. He nodded. Danielle's been talking to my niece. She's upset. Says you shut her out. I didn't shut her out, I said. She made a choice. I respected it. That's all. Mark leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing like he was squinting through the story. You know I've got no skin in this game, man. I'm not taking sides. But I've been thinking about my dad lately. That caught my attention. Mark rarely brought up his father. I knew there was history there. Some kind of quiet estrangement that hung between them like a curtain no one wanted to pull back. He was hard, Mark continued. Not cruel, just hard, distant. Always made it clear that love had to be earned. And I spent years trying to earn it. Failed every time. I don't blame him, not anymore. But I do wonder if he ever realized that I needed him more when I messed up than when I got things right. I stayed quiet, letting that settle. Mark turned to face me fully. I'm not saying you're like him, but I'm saying there's a fine line between a boundary and a wall, and only you know which one you built. His words sat in my chest like an anchor. Heavy, still, true in ways I didn't want to admit. I wasn't trying to punish her, I said finally. I trailed off, unsure of how to finish. You just didn't want to be used anymore, he said for me. I nodded. I get that, he added. I do. But sometimes we forget that our kids only learn how to ask for help by watching how we respond when they're at their lowest. If we don't show up then, they stop asking altogether. It wasn't an accusation. It was a reminder, a reflection from someone who had lived both sides of the equation. I looked down at the bottle in my hand, the condensation dripping onto my fingers. She humiliated me, Mark. At her wedding, called me overbearing in front of everyone. Laughed like I was a joke. He didn't flinch. And that hurt. Deep. I'm not saying it didn't. But what's hurting more now? The speech or the silence afterward? That question hit like a hammer. Because the truth was, the silence had become comfortable, familiar. But beneath it was something else, something raw and unresolved. I had made peace with not being needed. But I hadn't made peace with being resented. I hadn't healed from the sting of being laughed at by the two women who once looked to me for strength. Mark stood up and stretched, beer bottle nearly empty. You're not wrong for protecting yourself, Dave. But don't confuse survival with peace. You can be right and still be lonely. He gave me a half smile and a pat on the shoulder before heading back toward the fence. Anyway, my offer still stands. Poker night next Friday. You need to be around people who don't see you as a monster. I watched him disappear into the fading light, the yard growing dim around me. I sat there long after the sun dipped below the horizon, his words rolling over me like low thunder. There's a fine line between a boundary and a wall. That night, I didn't sleep well. My dreams were cluttered, half memories, half regrets. I saw Danielle at 10 years old, riding her bike for the first time without training wheels, falling and scraping her knee, crying until I scooped her up. I saw her at 16, screaming at me for not letting her go to a party where I knew trouble waited. I saw her at 24, standing on that wedding stage, beaming with pride, slicing me open with a smile. By morning, I still didn't have answers. But I knew this. I didn't want to be my father either. Cold, detached, unreachable. I wasn't ready to call her. Not yet. But maybe I was ready to think about it. Not as a surrender, not as a retreat from my boundary, but as a new way forward. One where I could still protect myself without sealing the door shut. One where I could let her rebuild trust if she was willing to meet me halfway. The first time she texted me again, it was short. Just, can we talk? No punctuation, no emojis. None of the usual casual fluff she used to throw into our messages like little lifelines. Just a plain, cautious sentence. I stared at the screen for a while, letting the words settle in, weighing the possibility behind them. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I wanted to be sure that if I opened that door again, it wouldn't swing wide enough for old patterns to come crashing back through. I wasn't interested in resuming the role of the unacknowledged savior. If we were going to talk, it had to be different. It had to be honest. And above all, it had to be mutual. 3 days later, she followed up with another message. I'm coming by this weekend. I'd like to sit down. Just you and me. I responded this time. Okay. That Saturday, she showed up around noon. Her car pulled into the driveway slowly, almost hesitantly, like even it wasn't sure it was welcome. She stepped out wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. I watched from the front window as she stood there for a moment, gathering herself before walking up to the door. I didn't rush to open it. I let her knock. Let her stand there in that silence she'd helped build between us. When I finally let her in, we didn't hug. We just nodded and walked into the kitchen like two people interviewing for a job they both used to have. She sat across from me at the table, hands folded, eyes darting around the room. The same room where we used to do her homework. The same table where we celebrated birthdays, cried after college rejections, argued about curfews. There was history between us, some of it sacred, some of it sharp. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, voice quiet, steady. "About everything. The wedding. The call. What I said." I let her speak. I didn't want to guide her. I needed to know if she'd found the path herself. "I was trying to be funny," she said. "I thought I was being empowering. But I see now how it must have felt to you. Like I was throwing everything you ever did for me in the trash." I stayed quiet. Not to be cold, but because I knew she needed to sit with the discomfort. To hear her own words echo back in the silence and understand the weight they carried. She took a shaky breath. "I messed up. I see that now. But I was scared too. I'd spent so much time trying to grow up, to feel independent, and the closer the wedding got, the more I felt like I hadn't really done that yet. So I lashed out. At you. Because you were always there. Always holding me up. And then you resented me for it," I said, finally breaking the silence. She nodded. "Yeah, I did. And that wasn't fair." I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't the same girl who used to sit at this table coloring with crayons and asking for juice. She wasn't even the same young woman who once called me in tears from her first apartment, overwhelmed by laundry and loneliness. She was someone else now. Someone shaped by her choices, her pain, her pride. And in a strange way, I admired her for showing up. For sitting in this moment with all the courage it took to admit she'd been wrong. But I also knew something else, something she may not have fully understood yet. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "But I'm also not the same." She looked up, eyebrows knit. "I used to believe that love meant always being there, no matter what. But I've learned that sometimes, love means knowing when to step back. When to stop letting people use your loyalty as a landing pad." "I wasn't trying to use you," she whispered. "I know," I said gently. "But that's what it became. You had a habit of running to me when things got hard, and pushing me away when things felt good. And I let you. I trained you to believe I'd always be there, no matter how deep the cut. That's on me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Not fully. She just nodded slowly, like someone finally hearing a truth they'd spent years avoiding. "I don't want to be that person anymore," she said. "I want us to be better." "We can be," I said. "But I'm not going back to how things were. If you want a relationship with me, it's going to be based on respect. That means you don't get to humiliate me publicly and then expect private forgiveness. You don't get to treat me like a relic when it's convenient and a safety net when it's not." "I understand," she said. I believed her. Not completely, not yet, but enough to keep talking. Enough to leave the door cracked instead of bolted shut. "I don't need an apology parade," I said. "But I do need consistency. I need to know that the next time you say something cruel, you won't call it a joke. That the next time you need help, it won't come with the expectation that I'll drop everything, because that's just who Dad is. That version of me is gone, and he's not coming back." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then I guess we have to start over." "Maybe not over," I said, "but from here." She smiled, small, hesitant but real. "Okay, from here." We didn't hug when she left. We didn't take a picture or share a sentimental moment. But we did stand in the doorway for a second longer than expected, looking at each other like two people who had finally learned how to speak a common language. After she drove off, I sat back down at the kitchen table. The quiet didn't feel so heavy anymore. It felt earned, not from cutting people out, but from carving space for what mattered. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe we'd talk more often. Maybe she'd drift again. Maybe we'd both stumble through the new version of this relationship and mess it up before we got it right. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to being the father who bled quietly. I was the father who learned how to heal. If you've ever had to choose peace over pleasing others, especially family, then you understand what it means to stand firm in your boundaries. Sometimes love isn't about giving endlessly, but about knowing when to stop giving yourself away. What would you have done in my shoes? Let me know in the comments. And if this story struck a chord, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales about family, choices, and self-respect. See you soon in the next story.